Well, I hope everyone's doing well. I'm really excited to be here today. This is a topic that, I think about a lot. And so I hope that this is fun, that you have some questions, some discussion, and I've kind of set it up for it to be a little bit interactive. And so what I will do is I'll use the chat for that. So please post comments, questions, responses. There will be a few times kind of throughout the presentation where I kind of prompt you to respond to some questions, some topics. So I have that kind of up on my screen, and so that's kind of how I'll do some interaction like during the presentation. Once we kind of move through the presentation piece, I want to make sure to leave some time at the end so that we can have some conversation, that you can ask questions, you can give thoughts, because I'm guessing not everyone's going to agree with me all the time, and I don't think you should, because my experience and kind of how I talk about things is mine, and it's based on my identities, my lived experience, and that's unique to me. So I hope that part of what this workshop thing does is to kind of spark reflection, spark some thoughts that you all have and how this might look in your own practice. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of jump to kind of the presentation piece. Um, so I don't, I didn't introduce myself, so I should probably do that. My name's Chris Fike. I am the regional representative on the board of directors for NASW Michigan for Region 5. And, this is again something that has become really interesting and really curious for me to explore. And so kind of where I'm going to start kind of going through some of stuff today is I'm going to give you kind of the story of kind of how this idea for this presentation kind of came together, and kind of walk you through my thought process, and just kind of give that context for you. And so here we go. Um, so kind of the idea came from a few months ago, I think. I gave a presentation on like trauma, to professional setting, kind of um, like human service professionals. Think specifically kind of working in like homelessness spaces. And, I felt like everything went really well, felt like there was really good working rapport with everyone who was there, very interactive, lots of questions, lots of discussion. Like it almost felt kind of familiar to me. And so I'm getting packed up, and I think, this went amazingly. Like good conversation, good response, lots of questions. I feel like it was an engaged presentation. And then, we do, evaluations, and I just kind of collect everything, put it in a folder, drive back to the office, and I start going through the presentation feedback. And, then I see these negative responses and some low ratings. I'm like, I never get low ratings, like not to be that person, but I feel like I'm doing okay in doing community presentations. I was a faculty member for 6 years. I kind of know how to do the teaching thing. But then I started looking closer, and the negative ratings were because I swore during the presentation. And so I didn't intentionally make the choice to swear in that presentation. Um, and so it's like, because it felt familiar, because it felt comfortable, because it was engaging, I'm sure that I did, because that's kind of a natural thing for me. I use a lot of swearing, for better or for worse. Um, and I'm thinking back, trying to remember, was there a time where, and I just couldn't think of it. And so it was like this like lack of awareness that I have, because it's just a part of my style, my presentation, how I talk. And so I kind of went through this, like my response was, well, shit. Um, I don't know what's going on. And so doing kind of some intentional reflection on kind of, what does this mean? How can I use this information? What can we learn from this? And so, kind of walking through this intentional reflection process, thinking about like identifying my feelings and kind of working through some of my feelings and understanding what kinds of thoughts I was having, kind of the negative thoughts, like some self-doubt, like, is this like what's happening? And then just really trying to make sense of this for myself. And so kind of through that process, kind of where I came with like this action plan piece was like, I want to learn more. So, I, appreciate, like, there's some really great books and great resources that I'll share with you as we go through the presentation. And I kind of went through and kind of consumed those things. And I'm like, this would be really fun to talk about within the context of doing social work. Like, how do we use language? How do we use swearing? What does that mean? What does that look like in the spaces that we tend to occupy, and working with clients, working in the community, working in organizations? And so, like, that's kind of where this whole idea came from, was like, I want to talk about it, I want to process it, I want to have this conversation with other social workers, because I think it's a thing that, I don't know if you're like me, but it can kind of catch you off guard. Um, like, you don't recognize that it's happening, and you want to make sense of what's the context here. And maybe that's just kind of my kind of natural introverted overthinking kind of thing. But I don't think that it is. Like, I think there is a genuine curiosity about what this can look like, what this means. Is this ethical? Is this professional? How do we use this? And so that's kind of the impetus for this, is kind of my own personal experience. Um, and so I kind of want to dive into some of that with you all. And so as we're going through this, if you have thoughts, if you have questions, again, throw them up in the chat. Like, I want this to be as interactive as possible. And I want you to kind of hold that reflective space for yourself as we're moving through this. And again, remember that, like, what I'm going to share, kind of the analysis that I'm going to make, and some of the arguments that I'm going to pose are, again, based on me. And so I want to share a little bit about myself so that you have some context for where I'm coming from and how that might look differently for you. And so with that, kind of I'm gonna start with introduction of myself, kind of walk you through things that influence me, things like different factors that I have to account for and attend to, um, not only in my practice, but just in how I present, how I engage with people, how I use language, how I use swearing, and set some context for that. I also will want to kind of explore your perspectives. So I'll have some prompts for you to respond to in the chat. Um, so I think it could be just fun to kind of get different people's perspectives, and as a starting place, and I'll walk through kind of the more uh, technical pieces of this. So looking at laws related to swearing, social work ethics. How do we kind of make sense of swearing within the context of ethics? And then I'm going to kind of offer a little bit of a critique on professionalism and what professional means. And so just kind of setting the stage, if you will. And then I'm going to jump kind of right into like a brief history of swearing, context for swearing, some of the linguistic pieces of why we swear, how we swear, context, all of that. And then look like the what does the research say? What does the science say about swearing? And then kind of wrap up, kind of walking through like some of the really concrete benefits of using swearing yourself, teaching others how to swear, what are the limits, what are the kind of those I don't know, those trends. Like what does that look like? How can we do this in an ethical way? How can we do this in a professional way? How can we do this in a way that meets your needs and then helps you meet the needs of the client systems that you're working with? And then again, kind of open it up for your thoughts, your perspectives, your reflection. So that's kind of where we're headed. But like I said, I want to start with me. And so kind of the kind of perfunctory ivory tower credentials. I have my undergraduate degree in psychology. I have a master's in counseling psychology, and I have my MSW with a macro concentration. So I've been doing a lot of this helping professional work for 20 years at this point. And so I feel like a lot of the experiences that I bring are, have been influential in terms of how I think about things, right? And so the other piece is thinking about like my identities. And so where I always start is like, you know, I've got to acknowledge that I check all the privilege boxes here, like white, cisgender, heterosexual, male identified, English speaker, non-disabled, um, currently living in Michigan, but kind of via Kentucky and Ohio and Arizona. Um, and then also considering my age as being kind of in that gap generation between Gen X and millennials. And what does that mean? What kind of influence does all of that have? In terms of kind of practice experience, I feel like I've kind of done a little bit of everything. Um, from being a residential worker to a case manager to, a crisis counselor to being a college professor, working in private practice, doing community-based therapy, and being a member of the board for our professional association. Like all of those things have contributed to like my thoughts and feelings related to kind of what I'm going to talk about today. And then just some kind of fun facts and context for getting to know me a little bit. Puppy parent, cat dad, um, married to a rock star social worker. I was in a doctoral program for social work. How all of that ended is complicated, so I'm not going to get into that. And I like to think that I'm pretty proficient in my use of profanity, meaning that I'm not afraid to swear. I use it all the time, have lots of experience with it, and I'm starting to kind of be more intentional and thoughtful about how I use it specifically within the context of my social work practice. And just some kind of, I don't know, fun facts, if you will. Kind of a sports junkie. So again, Lions fan, Kentucky basketball fan. I've got some experience with swearing and doing kind of the tribal thing. And so yeah, like lots of cussing and screaming at the TV, and that's not weird or anything at all. So again, experience with swearing. Um, tattoo, like I have all the tattoos. Um, kind of a part of how I think about myself is that, you know, I'm kind of a troublemaker, rebel rouser, but I'm credentialed to do it. So I have kind of this vested interest in trying to be intentional about subverting social and professional norms that I think are just dumb or racist or sexist or what have you. So being able to kind of leverage my own privilege. Um, and so kind of super nerd, um, Doctor Who, all that. So if you have a favorite doctor, you can put that in the chat. And mine's the 12th Doctor, and if you know anything about Doctor Who, then you kind of get the association, kind of grumpy old man with crazy eyebrows and very passionate about beliefs and very thoughtful and intentional. So that's kind of me. Um, so there's some context. And so that again, kind of holding all of this in mind, like this is kind of where I'm coming from. And what I want to do now is learn a little bit about you, kind of who's in the room, what are we working with, what are the things that you think about. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of walk through a series of prompts. And, admittedly, kind of the social work answer to every one of these could and maybe should be, it depends. But I'm going to kind of do some forced choice with you. So I want you to uh, commit to a yes or no, and let's see where we're at. So first prompt is, do you do you think that swearing in Michigan is illegal? Okay. Mostly no, some yeses. Cool. Okay. Second prompt. Do you swear in your practice? If you swear in your practice, why do you swear? If you don't, why don't you? Okay. It depends. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's not professional. Unprofessional. Okay. We'll definitely get into that. Okay, cool. Third prompt. Do you think that swearing in social work is ethical? And then kind of your rationale. Yep. Still getting it depends. Okay. And I get that and I agree. Okay. Okay. Next prompt. Do you think that swearing in practice is professional? And then what's your rationale? Yep. Okay. Okay. I love the diversity of perspectives that are here. Like, this is fantastic. Okay. And then last prompt for this slide. Do you think that swearing can be an effective intervention in practice? Great. Great. Okay. So thank you all for sharing. Like, this is great. I love all of the input and the diversity of perspective that we have. And so again, kind of keep in mind some of the stuff that I'm going to share is again based on kind of my view, my experience. And so holding kind of that space for like what we can do with it. How can we learn? How can we integrate things that seem reasonable and maybe not with things that seem unreasonable to us, but considering our context, because as social workers, that's kind of the cool thing is that we are a part of the change process, like who we are, like operating in that space, we're a part of that. Like whether we are intentional about that or not, we have to acknowledge that our presence is a part of the process. So, so I just think this is funny. Like there's no swearing in social work. Like that's kind of a perspective that um I feel like we were mostly taught, like, and maybe part of those social norms that we learned even growing up, like it's unprofessional, not appropriate in workplace, that kind of thing. And I want to get into talking through some of that. So where I'm going to start is looking at the law, right? And so, and this is broadly speaking, but I'll get more Michigan specific in a minute. Kind of generally, cursing in public is not typically an illegal offense if it rises to, inciting violence or illegal activity. If you're doing that in public, there is a possibility for like disorderly conduct charges. If it draws a crowd, maybe perceived to be a threat to public safety, again, charges are possible. A few states still make it illegal to curse in front of minors, which is interesting. Um, and I have more Michigan specific on that in a minute. And then again, if the language, the swearing rises to that legal definition of harassment or defamation, then again, charges would be possible in that context. In Michigan, there's a law in 1931 that made it illegal to swear or take the Lord's name in vain in front of women and children. And that was on the books for a very long time and wasn't repealed until 2015. So until 2015, it was illegal to swear in some capacity in the state of Michigan, which is fascinating. Yeah. So I'll just leave it at that. So right now, here's context. If we're going to start looking at kind of the ethical piece, kind of how I want to approach this is I'm just going to walk through the core principles of our profession that are, those that are outlined in, the Code of Ethics, and just kind of pose some questions related to like the definitions and examples provided in the code and things that just kind of come up for me when I'm thinking about potential use of swearing. And I'd encourage you just to kind of think of kind of your own questions that kind of pop up in your mind as I'm kind of walking through this. So the first one, looking at service, can swearing be effective in increasing our service opportunities to engage, or does it kind of impede our ability to serve? How can language potentially unite like social movements? Does swearing reinforce the hegemony and oppressive norms, either within our kind of social work profession, or kind of just social views as well? Does swearing acknowledge and or validate personal agency and lived experience, or does swearing validate kind of the negative self-thoughts and denigration? Um, does swearing connect people, or does it reinforce like power differentials? Um, does swearing communicate kind of that openness and vulnerability, or does it kind of validate some of that judgment stuff? And so I think that's, all of this is kind of just fascinating to think about, I think. Does swearing communicate empathy and vulnerability, or does swearing kind of communicate some level of incompetence, right? And so I think these are questions just that kind of came up as I was thinking through different perspectives here. And so I want to just kind of acknowledge, like, I have thoughts on all of this, and I'll kind of walk through kind of the analysis process that I use and kind of the context that I think about and kind of work through for myself. And so I think it's going to be a different process for everyone, but I also think it's important to go through this process, to be intentional in doing this reflective work. And because when we're in practice, like, we have to be intentional with the choices that we make in intervention, in engagement. Like, we have to be intentional with all of that because of the impact that we have. And so if we're not doing this intentional work, then I feel like we're missing something really significant that's a requirement of what we do. So just kind of leaving that there. Other ethical considerations that come up, again, from kind of the code of ethics, this idea of social workers kind of promoting and maintaining like high standards of practice. However, we choose to define that, how the agency or organization we work for defines that, and how does swearing kind of fit into that? Again, this idea of being able to attend to kind of that cultural competence and practitioner development thing. Like, how can swearing fit into that? Does swearing fit into that? What are some of those norms, and how do we either kind of fall in line with those norms or challenge those norms? And when do we make those decisions? How do we make those decisions? Another thing to think of, like, just the idea of self-disclosure, right? And lots of different perspectives on effectiveness or appropriateness of self-disclosure, and choosing whether or not to swear is a part of that. It's a choice that we're making about how we're engaging. So I think inherently it's disclosing something about our perspective on language. And kind of the other piece to that thought is, like, when we choose to swear or not, whose needs are we attending to? Are we attending to our own needs to swear or to communicate something, or are we actually attending to the client need and kind of seeing how they're engaging? I think that's a great question, Miriam, and I think it's that thing that we have to consider in all our interactions and all our engagements. And the other piece is, again, how do we kind of attend to potential discrepancies between our personal values, our professional values, and whether or not there's line up with the organizational values and norms in the places where we work, those spaces where we operate. And how does all of that kind of relate to use of language and swearing? And how do we navigate all of that? And I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers here, but I will kind of again reinforce, like, the intentionality. Like, we have to have awareness, we have to have understanding, we have to have context, and we have to make intentional choices. And so for me, where I tend to start from kind of this professional space, like is swearing professional, I go back to Flexner, right? Like that's where this idea for social work is or is not professional kind of emerge. And kind of my argument and my understanding and my perspective on this is like there are pretty serious consequences from, this quote, right? Like social work is not so much a definite field as an aspect of work in many fields. And so the challenge to social work as being quote unquote unprofessional has really led to like this push for professionalization, this push for defining professional, this push for identifying ways that we are perceived, right? Like that's really what that's about. It's not actually about work that social workers were doing at the time. It's about how do we create norms? How do we create standards? How do we kind of define professional? How do we have a measured way of saying, yes, we're a profession, right? And so when I think about what is or isn't professional and how we're defining that and who's defining that, this is always my starting point. So looking at the historical context for social work professionalism. And, it's always fascinating to explore this in context and think about the actual history of our profession, specifically here in the United States, right? Where did we start? Who were we? Who were we serving? What did this look like? And then this very clearly defined shift. And like that's kind of where we've become, right? And so there are a lot of things that we have to take into account when thinking about this idea of professionalization and professionalism. And so I'm going to kind of walk through my perspective and my thought process on this and kind of my response to kind of what this looks like in social work right now. And so where I start is like just looking at professionalism. What is professionalism? It's a standard with a set of beliefs about how we should function, how we should operate. Literature that I tend to consume argues that the standard itself is based on kind of white supremacist beliefs, white supremacist ideas that are kind of grounded in that racial subordination. That the standards of professionalism in social work have been historically defined by white supremacy culture. And I think there are big, big implications for that. And if you're curious about perspectives on this, please reach out. I have lots of research literature that I'd be happy to share, and kind of directions I can point you in to kind of explore more of kind of what this looks like. And so if we're gonna make the argument that professionalism in social work has been defined by white supremacy culture, then what is white supremacy culture? And white supremacy culture is that thing that privileges whiteness, subordinates non-white, non-Western professional standards, things related to how we dress, how we look, how we present, how we talk, how we use language, what does our work style look like, and things like timeliness, right? And if we're thinking about it at like this organizational level, what this tends to look like, kind of this white supremacy culture, it's an organization that has the belief that these traditional standards and values are are objective. Like there's no question they just are. Um, there's going to be this emphasis on urgency, on immediacy, rather than quality. Like we've got to get stuff done. We've got to hit our marks. We've got to have so many clinical hours every week, and we have to be able to build this and build that, and like that. That's a part of that. This idea of perfectionism is also a part of that because, again, how are we defining perfect? Like, what does that look like? Is that realistic? Who's defining that? And then this very binary, non-critical thinking is going to be yes, no, black, white, professional, not professional, with rigidity to it. And then just as a way of acknowledging um, how this looks, like contemporary literature has lots of examples of how kind of that social work professional culture is kind of inundated in specifically anti-Black bias. And so it it's context that we need to be aware of, that we need to acknowledge, and that we need to understand when we're thinking about what is professional. Um, yeah. And yeah, like white supremacy and patriarchy and capital, like all of that. Um, and so the way that I think about this idea of how we have defined professionalism in social work, like it's a tool to subjugate people of color, right? It's used to police and to regulate and to um, like set a standard. Whose standard? That's the bigger question, right? And essentially, we use professionalism as coded language for um, centering whiteness in workplace practices, centering male experiences, centering cisgender norms, like all of those things. And so I think it's important for us to have context to what is professionalism? How did we historically get to this place as a profession? And what are we doing about it? What kind of response are we having to it? Do we even acknowledge it? And so if we specifically look at swearing within this context, research clearly demonstrates that when we swear at work, it can have a negative impact on how others perceive us. That employers are much more likely to think less of an employee who swears. And the use of swearing brings that employee's professionalism into question. There's also this idea of like weaponizing professionalism essentially just to label groups as unintelligent or dumb or uneducated when they use, swearing. So it creates this more intense stratification and disconnect between those who are in charge, those who have power, and frontline workers, right? Now, the kind of the counter to some of this is that swearing has also been shown to have the potential for being able to foster social cohesion and positive relationships and improved communication within the workplace among colleagues. And, the quote here, I think, captures some of that perspective. It's like hearing a curse allows us to kind of shake off this sense of expected behavior. It allows us to feel more authentic, allows us to unmask what happens when we have the freedom to communicate in a way that maybe is more authentic, that maybe has shown to be effective. And so all of this context is part of kind of that analysis that I do and that I'll kind of present on the next couple of slides. But I don't know if any of you watched The Good Place. I reference it kind of throughout this presentation because it's amazing and it does a fantastic job of exploring like big philosophical things in a way that's accessible. And so this quote I feel is kind of perfect for social work. This idea of principles aren't really principles when we pick and choose which ones we're going to follow and when we're going to follow them, right? Like I don't think that's a thing that we can really do in social work. We can't just say we're going to follow this one over here and this one over here, but not this one over here because it doesn't really align with my personal values. And like we don't get to do the 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 pick and choose. So yeah. So the other piece, so this is kind of I'm presenting kind of my analysis here. So I'm going to make the argument, I'm going to start back with looking at our core values and kind of looking at that ethical alignment within the context of my perspective on the professionalization of social work, that professionalism, how it's been defined. And so I would argue that swearing can be viewed as resistance to that professionalism. That swearing can be a challenge to hegemony and to those white supremacist norms within our profession. Swearing can also be used as a tool to build rapport, to foster relationships, and to build solidarity with those clients and communities that we're working with. It can also be a reflection of values related to cultural competence and human diversity and empowerment. Can also be used as an intentional strategy to promote authenticity, to promote genuineness, to promote honest engagement, open engagement. And it can also be a mechanism to promote that conscious and intentional decision making that we have to do as social workers in the spaces that we operate. So kind of attending to all of the core values outlined in the Code of Ethics. So my argument is that swearing is an ethical thing that we can use to attend to kind of the principles of our profession. And so that's kind of like that like start up here. Like I view swearing as ethical, as challenging the idea of professionalism as defined by white supremacy norms. And so for me, swearing has a lot of value when used intentionally and reflectively. And so that kind of the next place I'm going to go to is just to talk about this idea of like creating opportunities for everyday resistance to those big concerns, right? So that resistance to the idea of professionalism as we have defined it. And for me, this looks like how I intentionally leverage my privilege and access to privilege as a means of resistance. So I'm just going to walk through like an example of what this can look like for me. And so kind of where I start is I think about my day. I think about who I'm going to see. I think about kind of what that looks like. And so the example here, today I'm going to see this client, and this is a long-term client. We have a really great rapport. We have really strong engagement. And kind of the most recent focus has been on navigating a new HRT regimen as an adolescent. And so context here. And so this is kind of where I start. I think about what choices can I make within the context of working with this client? What's going to be effective? And how can like my presentation, my behavior, my choices and interaction style kind of reinforce kind of those positive characteristics of engagement and promote kind of attending to what the client needs. And so I'm going to outline just some choices that I've made and how they kind of align with that idea. And again, this is going to look different for everybody. And so again, just reinforcing intentionality, right? And so choices that I've made, blue hair and, you know, eyebrow piercings and like ear piercings that aren't necessarily traditional. And so these are choices that I have found have a positive impact on the clients that I work with. And in this particular case, like a younger client, I work predominantly with LGBTQ, queer youth, and young adults. And I'll talk about this idea of like shifting expectations around language with Gen Z in particular. It's probably relevant for other generations, but for Gen Z in particular, and how this all kind of fits like a normal, positive engagement. And so I also am aware of like the quote unquote unprofessional perspective of what does it mean to have blue hair? What does it mean to have facial piercings? And then for me, I also think about like dress, right? And so I'm that person, like hoodie, like that's just a part of what I wear. And it's a choice. And it's a choice that I make knowing that it doesn't fit professional norms. I also know that kind of anecdotally, when I get feedback from clients, when I got feedback from students when I was teaching, is that it makes me more relatable. Like people feel like they can approach me easier. Like it promotes that positive relationship. And then I always wear like, khaki work pants. Because again, I can conform in some spaces. I'm less concerned with pants. And so I can conform there. Um, I have, these aren't my tattoos, but I have Star Wars tattoos on my hands. And when I'm wearing a hoodie, those are still visible. And so I have to think about, like, what does this mean within the context? Like, do I need to do anything? Do I need to kind of pull my sleeves down? But again, for the clientele that I work with, it builds some credibility for me. Like like I don't have any cool factor whatsoever, but when working with a younger population, there's a cool factor. Like I get a little bit of credit because I have tattoos, I have pierced, like there's some of that. And so with this client in particular, as I'm thinking about my day, I'm not going to have a concern about this presentation. And I could even push my sleeves up. I have, um, Louise Belcher kind of fanboy. So I have Louise tattoo on my arm. Not going to think about that in this context. Sometimes I'll have pull my sleeves down and make those intentional choices. I wear tennis shoes. And when I can, I wear Chucks because, again, kind of traditional kind of resistance, anti-authority perspective. And I kind of like that. Like that's part of what I communicate intentionally with choices I make about appearance. Um, and then in this case, I'm also gonna swear. Like, and again, use it in an intentional way to communicate support, to reinforce um, these ideas that my client is like to validate their experience. And a lot of what they talk about in this case is discrimination, bullying that they experience, you know, as a result of being trans. And so when they communicate this frustration, this anger, and these things, and this is a client who I first started working with them when they were 12, and like they just like baby face, like really young. And then the first meeting that I have, this client starts dropping the F-bomb, and I'm like, oh, that's so cute. And so like there's this norm with the language, and it's like, all right. And so maybe that's a way to build rapport, to be engaged, to demonstrate support, to communicate safety. Like that's not a concern that you need to have about language when we're meeting, right? Because there are clients who like will apologize every time they swear. And then how do we attend to that, right? And how do we, again, can navigate those very personal spaces that we're in, and how do we make those choices? And I like the example in the chat of, working with an older population, probably going to make different choices, right? Because of client comfort and kind of creating a safe space for them. So all of this is contextual, and all of this has to be intentional. So the choices that I make and the language that I use and how I use language and how I present myself, um, for me, it's kind of a way to demonstrate some resistance to what I define as this idea of professionalism grounded in kind of oppressive hegemonic ideas. And so I'm going to be intentional in communicating kind of my perspective. And again, it's going to be contextual, right? It's going to be like, what does that client need? And so I had this idea to do a small group discussion here. Um, and with the size group that we have, like, thank you all for that. Like, this is amazing. Um, like that doesn't seem realistic to me. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to kind of give each of you, let's say like 3 or 4 minutes just to kind of reflect on these prompts. And so I want you to think about um, like your own experience as a social worker. Or if you're a social work student, like think about your experiences, think about your lived experience, and consider an instance in which you intentionally decided whether swearing was an appropriate intervention or tool, and think about like what are the factors that contributed to your decision and how that decision kind of reflected or reflects your identity as a social worker, those things that resonate for you. How do you see yourself, and how does this either challenge that or reinforce that? And then, after 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to see if there are, any volunteers to kind of talk about that. And then we'll kind of move into kind of the next phase of the workshop. So I'm gonna uh, just shut up for a few minutes and let you all do some of that reflective work and give you some space to do that. So I'm going to give you about one more minute and then see if there's some volunteer or two to share their thoughts. All right. Since I have no real sense of a minute and I didn't time it or anything, I'm going to see if anyone would be willing to kind of share what you were thinking about with these prompts.
Um, I will.
Great.
I um I started working in like the substance use field, so I feel like that, being having that relatability, especially if you're not somebody in recovery, it gives you a little bit more relatability with the clients. And I think in those moments, because I worked in inpatient where like people there would be people that would police them for swearing often, but I'm like, they have a lot more going on right now that they're trying to do than worry about what language they're using. And so that was always that motivation for me there, and I'm a swearer in life. And so obviously if the client is not swearing and they don't swear, and so like I'm not going to swear in front of them because I'm going to
Right.
respect that about them. But
Okay.
if I know that about them, I don't feel like I'm being like authentically me with them
Yeah.
if I'm not, if I'm choosing to say things in such a professional way that really isn't like how I would say them. Because I think a lot of people go in to see therapists and counselors and stuff like that, thinking it's going to be like the movie where like you're laying on a couch and it's this person in a suit with a clipboard, and then they get intimidated by that and by that thought. And so being able to be more authentic, I think allows people to open up a little bit more and know that you're not just like a snooty counselor who's like judging everything that they're saying, I guess. So that's always like been the motivation for me. Um, and I think it builds connection. And I think that, telling somebody like if they're having a really hard time, and I might say like that's shitty. Like that sounds like something really shitty that happened, because anything else might, like, especially if there's someone who swears and that's the way they express themselves, like they're gonna understand that I'm empathizing with them by using that versus like, wow, that sounds like it was a really unhealthy situation. Like they're gonna understand that I'm connecting with what they're saying more if I'm like, God, that was really shitty.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. Like again, like all of this is personal and intentional, right? Like the choices that we make. And if we're not being intentional with how we're presenting, how we're engaging, language that we're using, then we're being disingenuous with clients, right? And if we really want to have that real authentic engagement and connection, we have to understand all of that.
Hi, I'm Deidre Carter. I work for the school systems, and I hear cursing a lot.
I would
Uh,
imagine.
and, and it's interesting because that this topic will come up because I was just thinking that's how I'm going to respond to my kids. When they start cursing, I'm going to start cursing you back. And so that's totally inappropriate. I would never do it. All I'm saying is that the children are so disrespectful with their words, and it's role models. We should be role modeling correct behavior.
Hmm.
And I have a lot of students that get into fights as a result of their swearing at each other. And I tell them, I said, you're too young to be swearing for one. Okay. And when you swear, those are fighting words. Okay. You don't understand that when you swear at someone, you're causing some energy within them to have them respond to you back, even though you may think it's fun, it's nice or whatever. I mean, it's cute or whatever. That person is offended by it, and you shouldn't be using it.
Yep.
So I try and teach the students that, it's not appropriate to use it, but these days and age, I'm telling you, these kids, they swear like sailors. And as far as an intervention, I feel like, well, maybe if I swear back, but I wouldn't. But and just to give them
Yep.
example of this is what, this is not appropriate. You don't have to use those words. And most people who do swear, being judgmental here, they usually don't have the words to express themselves. That's a little bit judgmental, but it's also true, you see. So
Sure.
I just wanted to add that. I just wanted to add
Okay.
that.
Yeah, thank you. And
Mhm.
so I appreciate kind of the feedback and the reflection here, because this is great, because this is the work that we have to do, right? And so with that, I'm going to kind of make a transition here, and like let's start talking about swearing specifically. So I'm just going to rip the band-aid off, and extra credit for people who can tell me the reference here. But I think this quote is just kind of perfect to set the stage for what we're going to talk about. And so with that, I want to let's get into it. And so some of the key resources that I kind of pulled from um is like they're here. Kind of where I started though is because I like TV. And so and Nick Cage is one of those guys who like there's just something about that energy, and hearing him swear is amazing. And so if you have Netflix and are curious about that, watch the history of swear words on Netflix. Like it's fantastic. It walks through like each episode is a different swear word, and looking specifically at the history and the evolution of it. And so it's great. It's been a great resource. I'll also reference the book What the F by Bergen, and also the book Holy Shit by Melissa Moore, and just kind of provide some context for, again, kind of my thoughts on language. And here's like some evidence around the use of swearing and what it's looked like, how we use it. Um, and so I'm going to start with just a brief history of swearing. And when we think about just the idea of swearing in general, I think that like some of these questions just kind of come up, right? Like what gives certain words like the power to have like this shock and offensive response? Why do people swear in the first place? Where do like bad words originate, right? Like where do these words originate? Where did they come from? And how has that kind of evolved over time? And so the work that Melissa Moore has done is specifically a deep dive into kind of that history. And I'm just going to give a quick snapshot here because there's too much to get into. In kind of this space, but I do want to give you kind of a sample. And so her argument, her thesis around the use of swearing over time is that swearing reflects cultural obsessions, that whatever's considered obscene or problematic is implicated in the words used as profanity. And so looking at, different eras of history from ancient Rome all the way up to kind of modern day, we can see like what was the focus? What was the motivation? What were the factors that contributed to something being profane? And you can kind of look at just how some of that has shifted over time, and what were those contributing things that led to kind of that shift. And so I think it's just like, I like history. I like understanding language and linguistics. And so this stuff is just fascinating to me. And I would really, again, encourage you to check out her book and to look at the Netflix documentary, like, again, kind of breaking down each era, breaking down each word that we consider profane in modern day and where that kind of came from. And you'll find that kind of in the notes section on this slide, kind of that evolution. Like the things that we think about as profane are reflections of cultural obsessions. And one of the really cool things that I feel like, at least I feel like it's cool, that I'll talk about is like what is kind of being seen in research and what's being seen in the literature is like a shift, like a generational shift in perception of swearing and what is more acceptable, what's becoming more obscene, and how that looks. Um, so I think it's again fascinating. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but you can kind of get an idea of kind of evolution over time. Where I do want to spend some more specific time is looking at like the science related to swearing. And again, Bergen makes the same argument that Moore makes, and that it's cultural judgment and cultural obsession that makes words profane, right? So this idea of power and social censorship and social acceptability can provide the context for what becomes obscene, what we perceive as profane, what we perceive as a bad word, right? And we see that being predictive, right? So the best predictors on kind of the evolution of profanity are it's to look at those trending social taboos, like what is emerging socially that we're starting to have some kind of response to. How is that different from different eras? How does that kind of compare? And so it's this idea like profanity is a cultural phenomenon and a response to social factors. Um, and as taboos kind of emerge, the use of swear words like becomes like an act of resistance, becomes an act of social demonstration. Like the meaning behind words and how we choose to use words shifts, right? And so this idea of acting against the norm gives swearing power, because you're breaking social norms, you're breaking those social regulations. And so I would imagine that we all have thoughts on that. Like, what does that look like? What does that mean for us? Why should we give a shit about this, right? And so I think it's really curious and really fascinating to explore. And I love the comment in the chat, like this shift with kids, right? And so we're seeing, like, I'm going to talk about this more specifically in a minute, but we're seeing this shift with this younger generation and what is perceived as more profane or more obscene than what like my generation perceived as obscene, what we kind of socially accept as obscene. And it's fascinating, and I think it's kind of fantastic. But I'll talk about that in a minute. And so with profanity and with particular like bad words, like there's an evolution of words too, right? So there are times where maybe words that we would consider obscene, they were just some innocuous word. Like there wasn't any association with vulgarity. There wasn't any association with obscenity. And then social changes happen, taboos emerge, and the word becomes profane. And it's like even if we talk about like the word fuck, right? Like that's the one that like the big one, right? And so like we define that as like the bad word because of like social context. And it hasn't historically always been a word that we've viewed as vulgar, right? And so there's this evolution of the word. Like words become profane and then they just can kind of phase out. Like they don't have that same meaning as we see social shifts. And that happens over time. And so I'm going to get into talking about like that shift that's being seen in the research with specifically with um, Gen Z. And so what we're seeing with this generation, and it's part of why um, I make the choices that I make with presentation and with word choice with the clientele that I work with, because I predominantly work with uh, people from this generation. So working with adolescents and kind of emerging adults. And so what we're seeing is that like words related to sex, to bodily functions, to religion, to like the more traditional swear words that as we would define them are becoming less offensive to this generation than other generations. And what we're seeing kind of that shift to is that like they're taking far more offense and viewing um language that denigrates others, whether that's on ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, ability, like those are the obscene terms now, right? Like there's this shift from fuck and shit and all of this to something like racial slurs and slurs towards women and slurs towards trans folks. Like though that's obscene. Like those are the obscenities that are kind of replacing or like vulgarity. So we're seeing that intentional shift away from like traditional swear words that our generation knows to like this is what's important to this generation. And I think it's important for us to be aware of that context if we're working in spaces with this generation, because it means we have to make adjustments, have the understanding of what that means. And so this idea of like profanity that we would define isn't viewed as bad necessarily unless it causes harm, right? And so I feel like that's different. Like there's less judgment communicated with that. And I think for me, like that's an amazing transition. Like let's focus on profanity that hurts, right? Like that's the vulgar language. It's a language that hurts. Um, and so I think it's important for us to be aware of this context and to kind of integrate that knowledge into like our professional identity and into our own personal professionalism, right? And make choices related to that. Um, we also see with this generation like more positive associations with profanity. Like there's more perceived like likability and accessibility and genuineness with use of like traditional swearing. It's can be viewed as useful, practical, cathartic, and funny. Like and profanity helps us to express like some of those big feelings, like when we don't quite have language, but we want to communicate meaning. Like, and so I think it's really fascinating. And important for us to be aware of this. I think other context is looking at just like biological mechanisms related to the use of swearing and what happens in our body when we swear. And so science has shown that swearing can trigger our sympathetic nervous system. Um, like, and it's like that idea of like when you stub your toe, you swear. Like my go-to, like I know whenever I do something dumb because I'm not super coordinated, like I stub my toe and like fuck. And so what science is saying, like there's some therapeutic response to that, right? Like they're like it's a different pathway. It's that same pathway as like our flight or fight response. And there's even evidence that's demonstrated that swearing can increase our pain tolerance. It's like that thing I think about here is like there was an episode of Mythbusters. I don't know how many of you watched Mythbusters, but it was they replicated a study um, of having people put their hand in a bucket of ice, and they made the two different groups. So there was a control group that um, just used like a normal like couch, and they would just say couch, 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 and the experimental group would use the word fuck. So like fuck, fuck, fuck. It's like just repeated for as long as possible. And what they found was that people who used the swear word were able to tolerate having their hand in the ice, so able to tolerate that pain for longer than their counterparts were. And so I think it's fascinating to think about that. Um, yeah, and so um, other kind of context here is like we also see those negative associations with profanity, like those socially negative associations. Like the people who swear have lower education, they have weak language skills, or less control of their behavior, and that they're norm violators, right? Like those are there, and we know that, and we probably perpetuate that in some way because those are social norms, right? And so again, having that awareness. Um, and then this like the variance in response is dependent on context and speaker, right? And so depend like socially making a judgment about someone's use of swearing is going to vary on who they are, how they present. Um, And so what we see in science too is that like the evidence of harm as it's related to swearing was when profanity was used within the context of like verbal abuse, right? And so kids who experienced racial slurs or gender slurs or LGBT related slurs reported increase in anxiety and depression, and just generally decreased social connection, increased kind of isolation from peers. And so, again, when we're working, particularly with youth and with children and young adults, it's important to, again, kind of understand that context and to not discount like the impact of language on their development, on the emergence of symptoms that they're experiencing. And then just kind of a quote to kind of transition here. Again, like kind of uh, irreverent joke, but it's funny because I don't know how many of you know this where this movie comes from. I would assume a few, but it's fantastic. It's an outlet for me. I watch it all the time, or I used to. And it's just Paul Rudd is a vampire and never ages, and so it's just amazing. And so all of that to kind of transition to talking about like how do we learn to swear? Like what does that mean? And so how do we learn these things that we learn? about language. And so think about the first time that you swore in front of caregivers. Like, what were the feelings there? What were the thoughts there? Like, I remember when I did it, and was intentional. Like, I was like 7 years old, and using, like, I didn't start small. Like, I went right for the big word, and I knew I wanted to go for the big word because it would have the most impact. And so I'm thinking, like, I want to bring attention, I want to stir something, and I want a response from my parents, right? Like, I wanted that response. And so it was like active resistance, active antagonism. So think think about, like, what consequences were you anticipating in doing that? What consequences did you kind of receive? And like, I don't know that I actually thought there would be consequences because, like, I didn't think about that. And so I didn't know what to expect. And that's true. Like, making that assumption, I am making that assumption. And again, context, like, uh, my my experience. And so maybe context too is thinking about opportunities when you had the chance to but chose not to, right? Like, I think that's important to consider. Like, what were the factors that led to that decision? Um, and so, I mean, consequences that I received, my parents were soap in the mouth. Like, I became a connoisseur of soap taste from a very young age. And so that those were consequences. Um, and then what did you learn about yourself in from the choice that you made? Either the choice to swear, the choice not to swear. What were kind of those messages that were communicated? What was reinforced? Kind of what was subverted? What did you learn? And then thinking about, like, what does that look like in hindsight, right? Like, what were potential social and cultural factors that contributed to that choice, whether that was intentionally to challenge authority or what have you. Like, what were those factors? And so I think it's fun to think about, like, our own personal experiences and to try to deconstruct them from the knowledge and the context that we have now. And I know I'm looking at the time, and yeah, not gonna have as much discussion as I wanted, but I will provide contact information. And so if we're looking at kind of this specific example, like, I'm gonna wash your mouth out with soap. Like, if we have this punishment response to swearing, then like the response here is, like, the intent was like symbolic cleansing, right? It's meant to be a deterrent. And so what messages are being communicated? And it's like social norm stuff, right? Swearing is dirty, swearing is worthy of punishment, swearing is unacceptable. And kind of what child is hearing is, if I don't conform, I'm going to be punished. I'm supposed to obey those in charge. I'm supposed to obey my parents. I'm supposed to obey caregivers. Um, we're also hearing that swearing, again, is an unacceptable personal choice, and that I'm going to be judged for making the decision to use curse words. Um, like, just with this specific example, looking at like contemporary alternatives, it's like, let's understand motivations. Let's look at our behavior. Let's look at our motivations and looking at our response. And then reflect on, how do we develop a healthier response rather than like this physical response. And I would assume in literature also kind of reinforces, like, this, like, wash your mouth out with soap isn't as common as now as it was with my generation. And so I think there's some shift with that. Um, And I would agree that not all of it is necessarily bad. I think it's context and what we're taking away from it, how it's being communicated. Like all of that's important to have awareness of, right? Yeah, teachable moments. Um, and so just kind of to wrap up this discussion, I just wanted to share like some research I found on the best tasting soaps. And so if you're curious, I'm going to share my slides with NASW and they can distribute them and you can check out this resource. Someone who actually went through and did taste testing with soap, and this is what they found. I have my own personal list, but we don't have time to go into that. If you're curious, contact me. Um, Again, swearing is can be good for us, right? Like it helps people tolerate pain, ease stress, build and maintain relationships and connections, and potentially to be more persuasive. Like just the social benefits, like it can build camaraderie, it can build solidarity. It can help create a sense of trust and intimacy and authenticity. Um, and it can be healing, right? Like we talked about like that tool for pain management. And then specifically like with that study I referenced with the ice bucket, um, like seeing a bigger impact when it's done in our first language. So if we're not a native English speaker, don't swear in English, swear in your native language because it's more impactful. Um, and then like the intensity of the swear word matters. So we found that the words, um, I don't know, I'll just use an example. So fuck is much more effective in managing pain than say but, right? Like there's an intensity factor that's important here too. And I like this quote and I feel like it very much reflects a social work-ish perspective. Like we always want to approach from kind of this loving space, but sometimes we just have to lay it out as it is, right? Sometimes we just have to break it down. Um, so, and I think that's important context and kind of reflects a lot of the things I wanted to communicate today. Kind of things to think about as we're ending here. Kind of going back to those questions I posed, like that the question when we question principles, you know, what perspective shifts have happened for you? What are thoughts that have come up as it relates to these things? Um, and so, like, does swearing impede our ability to serve? Does it help us connect people and strengthen relationships? How effective is it in communicating vulnerability and all of that? And then again, if you have outstanding questions, I'm going to provide my contact information. Please reach out. Like I'd love to continue this conversation. So thank you all for being here. I love that there were so many of you here that took time on your Friday afternoon. And again, keep in mind, like what I've shared is kind of my perspective based on my experience. Yours is going to look differently. And so I'm just encouraging intentional work around that.